Well, last fall, Brett Kavanaugh was confirmed to the Supreme Court despite severe accusations of sexual misconduct. It wasn't the first time a nominee faced such charges. Clarence Thomas was narrowly confirmed after a contentious hearing in 1991. Since then, Justice Thomas has made his mark on the high court. Take a look.
Today, Clarence Thomas is the longest-serving current justice on the Supreme Court, and some analysts say he's become one of the most influential. And since he took his place on the bench, Thomas has been a prolific writer. His judicial opinions have been widely discussed in law schools and among judges. Thomas has been a consistent originalist, believing in interpreting the Constitution just as its authors intended, as opposed to the idea that interpretations of the Constitution should change with the times. And as author Myron Magnet says in his new book, Clarence Thomas and the Lost Constitution, Thomas's opinions are a blueprint for future justices to return to the original meaning of the Constitution.
Well, joining us now is the author of Clarence Thomas and the Lost Constitution, Myron Magnet, and welcome to the 700 Club.
Such a pleasure to be with you. Good morning, Gordon.
Well, in our introduction, we brought up Kavanaugh, which naturally leads to a discussion of Anita Hill. What do you think was going through Justice Thomas's mind during the nomination battle for Kavanaugh?
You know that old saying, fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me. I think that's probably what he was thinking. The left was playing exactly the same playbook that they ran against him. And, down to even the can of Coke that Christine Blasey Ford asked for in the hearings. And if you thought that there was any truth in what Anita Hill said 28 years ago, seeing exactly the same charade go on almost 3 decades later shows you that there is nothing that the left won't do to assassinate a character, to keep an originalist off the court, because they want to hang on to this incredible lever of power that they have. I think now that part of what makes the bitterness of today's politics is that we have two separate theories of what the legitimacy of our government rests on. On the Clarence Thomas side, you have the Constitution of Liberty, which guarantees each citizen's right to pursue his own happiness in his own way, in his family, in his local community, and expects self-reliance. On the other hand, on the left, you have the Fairness Party, which believes that the government exists to make rules, to make people equal, to make things fair, and that constitutes real democracy in its concern for workers, the poor, the weak, the excluded. And the only thing that party doesn't get is that this is not representative self-government. It is being ruled by experts, and it is precisely that kind of being ruled as opposed to self-government that Clarence Thomas's whole jurisprudence is an effort to reverse. If you read his writings over the last 28 years, you see that he lays out a history of the 3 stages by which our original Constitution of Liberty got subverted. And he lays out, as you say, this roadmap for how to get back to it. And what he says is, you know what, we don't hesitate when the people's elected Congress passes a law that we think is unconstitutional to say, sorry, we overturn it. So judges, being human, obviously are fallible. And if we look back, and it's our constant duty to look back over our own work, if we look back and think our esteemed predecessors have made a mistake, we need to say so and we need to reverse. So when our predecessors gutted the 14th Amendment and allowed 90 years of Jim Crow in the South, we should say that was a mistake and we should overturn it. When the New Deal court took control of the whole economy, something that the Constitution doesn't give them, we should say they made a mistake by doing so and overturn it. When the Warren Court created all these rights for criminals, for unruly students, for unruly residents of housing projects that don't exist in the Constitution, but only exist in the minds of a bunch of liberal judges, we should overrule it. When the court gives us a right to abortion that exists nowhere in the Constitution, we should overrule it. So there is Clarence Thomas saying, let's get rid of this stuff. Just 2 weeks ago, he wrote a majority opinion for the court in a very technical case, but the last paragraph of it says, and by the way, this whole case turns on a precedent that is actually incorrect. We overrule it. He's speaking for the majority of the court here. So I think that we now see how the stages by which the Constitution has been subverted can be reversed. And an interesting fact is that 20% of the judges whom the Trump administration has elevated to the federal bench are ex-Clarence Thomas clerks whom he has mentored and fostered now over 28 years and made into a kind of little family. So not only has he given us this roadmap of how to restore the original Constitution of liberty, which 232 years after the Constitutional Convention remains the most avant-garde idea of government in its protection of individual liberty. Not only has he given us this roadmap, but he's given us the troops who can carry out the program.
Let's talk
so
about...
I think I think he'll be seen as the most consequential jurist of our era 100 years from now.
Well, let's talk about how he got here, because it's an unlikely story, and you give us the roadmap for that in your book. One of the things that really stuck out for me is, as a graduate of Yale University, he found that because employers thought that he was admitted to Yale based on some kind of preference, based on the color of his skin, he could not find a job. And so he took a price tag off a cigar, put that on his diploma, and then put it down in his basement because he said, this degree is now worthless to me. How did you get that story?
That's exactly right. Well, he tells that story in his wonderful memoir, My Grandfather's Son, because he was raised by this extraordinary man. And, you know, Clarence Thomas's story, it's not quite a log cabin to the White House, but it is a kerosene-lit shanty in a Georgia swamp to the high court bench. And when he was 7, his mother, now divorced, moved him and his little brother to a Savannah slum. He grew up under segregation after a year of incredible poverty in which he was cold and hungry all the time. His mother realized she couldn't keep the kid, sent him to her father and stepmother, only a few blocks away, but her father was this extraordinary man, this self-made man who had got religion. He'd converted to Catholicism. He sent his grandsons to Catholic school to get a very rigid, God-centered education where the nuns taught them that all men are created equal and therefore segregation was wrong. This in segregated Savannah. And his grandfather put the boys to work delivering oil after school and on weekends, and they had a farm across the street from where their ancestors had been enslaved. And he put them to work farming every summer, so that this is a guy who learned self-reliance by being self-reliant. Okay, he goes to seminary because he wants to be the first black priest in Savannah. And there he discovers real racism, becomes angry, drops out of seminary, goes to Holy Cross, meets with more racism, becomes an angry black radical. And he ends up, at the end of his junior year, going to a demonstration in Harvard Square that turns into a full-scale riot with businesses vandalized and burned, cops pulled out and beat up. And he goes back to Holy Cross in the morning, and he goes into the chapel and he prays to God to relieve him of this anger, which is going to ruin his life. But he's watching, meanwhile, And he says to himself, do I really believe that this is a country of opportunity? He says, I really believe it. Do I really believe, Mr. Jefferson, that this is a country that believes all men are created equal? I believe it. So he then goes back to the maxims of his grandfather, that where there's a will, there's a way. And although his grandfather was a lifelong Democrat, these maxims are conservatism, right? Walk humbly with God, do your duty, be self-reliant. And this is what Thomas discovered. And he also discovered when he was seeing affirmative action only just really getting underway when he got to Holy Cross, and then in full swing when he gets to Yale Law School, he sees that you take kids who are smart but unprepared and put them in an institution that's a rung or two above their abilities, and kids who would in other circumstances succeed beautifully fail and become resentful and angry and take courses that are easy and either drop out or become angry and don't live up to their potential. So from there, he goes into the government. The only job he can get is with the Attorney General of Missouri, and who takes him to Washington with him. And there he gets picked up by the Reagan administration and becomes a government administrator and involved with civil rights. And he's looking at affirmative action from the point of view of a bureaucrat, of a high bureaucrat. And he says, is this doing anybody any good, or is it just making its supposed beneficiaries resentful? And is it making everybody else look at them as if they're inferior, as if they could not make it without this special hand up? And what he finally comes to the conclusion of is that in America, this is an opportunity society. You have to make it by yourself, and there is no government solution to the problems of Black Americans now that we actually had the 1964 Civil Rights Act, now that we have actually spent half a century where the center of our politics is getting rid of racism and making opportunity for anybody who is willing to walk through the door. And so Clarence, if you look at his jurisprudence, Clarence Thomas is very focused on the idea of making sure that Black communities are safe, that education in inner cities is really functional to make people have careers and be citizens, but otherwise to leave people free to make their own fates and make them responsible for themselves. And he says you cannot have a free republic such as the Founding Fathers envisioned unless you have free citizens. It takes a special kind of character to be capable of liberty. And that means that you have to be self-reliant. You have to say, wait a minute, I'm not a victim. I actually can overcome circumstances. I can overcome adversity, and I can make my own fate. And incidentally, when you look at people who do this, when you look at the George Washingtons of the world, or the Marie Curies, the George Washington Carvers, what do you see? You see people who not only made their own fate, but who changed the world for the better. And this is the kind of republic that the framers tried to give us. And we need to have the kind of culture which produces the characters who can take advantage of this liberty that the framers so magnificently imagined for us.
The book is called Clarence Thomas and the Lost Constitution. We've just scratched the surface of it. It's available wherever books are sold. And thank you so much for being with us. That was
such a pleasure. Thank you.